Silence swallowed the penthouse hallway like the lid of a coffin being sealed. Then the gunfire erupted. Sharp cracks split the air, echoing off marble walls so white they glowed like bone. The acrid smell of gunpowder choked everything, thick, metallic, choking. Rafael Moreno stood motionless in the doorway, his broad shoulders framed by the light spilling from his daughter's bedroom behind him. 6'2" of controlled power reduced to absolute stillness. His dark eyes, storm gray at the centers, burning with fury at the edges, tracked the armed men flooding the corridor, their black tactical gear moving like a swarm of locusts through the penthouse he had built as a fortress. His daughter, Ava, 7 years old and burning with fever, stood exposed in the doorway directly behind him. Pale as porcelain, her small frame swallowed by an oversized nightgown, her dark curls matted to her forehead with sweat. She had been screaming moments before. Now she was silent, frozen like a rabbit sensing the shadow of a hawk. Sergio and Theo, Rafael's most trusted lieutenants, both men with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun, moved toward their weapons. But the angles were all wrong. The gunmen were too close, too coordinated. Bullets already cutting through the air like blades, and every trajectory pointed in one direction. Toward the child. That was the moment when everything changed. Aria Santos moved. The woman in the stained apron, her orthopedic shoes worn through at the heels, her hands calloused from 16-hour shifts at a rundown diner on Chicago's South Side, threw her entire body between the child and the gunfire. Not thinking. Not hesitating. Just moving like a blade through butter, instinct overriding survival. The first bullet hit her shoulder. The impact spun her backward, a gasp tearing from her throat, but she remained standing. Her feet planted. Her arms spread wide. The second bullet tore through her side. She staggered, her hand clutching her ribs, blood blooming across her apron like a flower opening in the darkness. But she did not fall. She did not move aside. She stayed. The third bullet caught her upper arm. The fourth struck her lower abdomen. The fifth bullet meant for leverage, meant to make Rafael Moreno understand the cost of his defiance, hit her chest, close to her heart. Each impact jerked her body like a puppet with its strings cut, but she remained standing, remained shielding, remained defiant against the tide of violence. Ava screamed. A sound so pure, so devastated, that it seemed to shatter the very walls around them. The gunman fled. Footsteps thundering down the corridor, echoing down the stairwell, disappearing into the night like ghosts dissolving into smoke. Rafael Moreno, the man who signed death warrants without blinking, who had spent 12 years staring at the empty nursery where his first child never came home from the hospital, who had built an empire on the principle that mercy was weakness, dropped to his knees. He caught Aria's bleeding body as she collapsed, his large hands cradling her like she was made of glass about to shatter. Her blood soaked into his white shirt, spreading across his chest like a map of devastation. His voice broke on her name. Aria. Aria, stay with me. Stay with me. His hands shook. His hands, which had never trembled through 12 years of violence and loss, trembled like a child's in that moment. Sergio and Theo stood frozen, their weapons drawn, their eyes locked on their boss. In 15 years of working for Rafael Moreno, they had never seen him like this. They had never seen him kneel for anyone. They had never seen him cry. But what she did not know was that this single moment, this act of defiance against death itself, would unravel everything both of them had spent years constructing as armor against a world determined to destroy them. Drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now, let us go back to the beginning, to 3 months earlier, when Aria Santos stood in the ashes of her old life, counting $5 in her pocket, with no way of knowing that everything was about to change. 3 months earlier. The morning broke gray and cold over Chicago's South Side, the kind of morning that seemed to drain color from the world itself. The bus stop smelled like exhaust and wet concrete. Aria Santos stood in the line, her uniform already on beneath her winter coat, her orthopedic shoes soaked through from a puddle she could not avoid. She was 29 years old but looked decades older. Exhaustion had carved lines around her eyes, traced the hollows of her cheeks, bent her shoulders forward like she carried an invisible weight that never lifted. She reached into her coat pocket and counted the bills in her wallet. $5. That was all she had left until Derek Collins, her manager at the diner, paid out the night shift tips on Friday. $5 to cover 3 days. To feed herself, to pay for bus fare, to exist in the world until Friday arrived. The bus arrived, groaning like a wounded animal. Aria climbed aboard and found a seat near the back, her small frame folding into the plastic chair. Outside the window, Chicago passed by our luxury high-rises downtown where the glass reflected nothing but sky and money, then the descent into neighborhoods where the buildings crumbled like teeth falling from a rotting jaw. The diner appeared around 6 in the morning, before the sun had properly risen. The Paradise Diner, faded gold lettering on a weathered sign, fluorescent lights buzzing like they were dying. She had worked there for 2 years, ever since the fire had taken her apartment and everything in it except a single photograph of her late husband, Michael. That photograph was in her locker now, protected in a plastic sleeve. Derek Collins was already there, smoking a cigarette by the service window, his manager's clipboard tucked under one arm. 42 years old, belly spilling over his khaki pants, his thinning hair combed in a way that fooled no one. When he saw Aria, his mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "You're 3 minutes early," he said. "That means you're committed." "I like that." He moved closer, his breath reeking of last night's whiskey and cigarettes. "You know what else I like?" She stepped sideways, moving toward the employee lockers. "The early morning rush." "The early morning rush," he repeated, mocking her tone. "Sure. That too." He grabbed a coffee from the pot behind the counter. "You got your daughter in school today? That little shelter baby of yours?" The way he said it, shelter baby, made her skin crawl. But she did not respond. She had learned that responding only made it worse, extended the interaction, gave him more space to occupy. "Double shift today," he continued, checking his clipboard. "Midnight to 4 in the morning. You'll be by yourself for the last hour, closing up. Try not to steal anything this time." She had never stolen anything. The previous week, he had accused her of taking $100 from the register. She had been there for 6 hours while he was not. When she asked to check the security footage, he laughed and said the camera had been broken for months. The $5 in her pocket suddenly felt even smaller. The diner filled with people as dawn broke. Construction workers needing coffee before their shift, elderly women meeting for breakfast, a few night shift workers grabbing food before going home to sleep. Aria moved through the space like a ghost, quiet and efficient, filling coffee cups, clearing plates, taking orders. Her feet hurt by the second hour. The orthopedic shoes helped, but nothing could truly ease the pain of standing for 16 hours straight on cracked linoleum. At 3 in the afternoon, Derek called her over to the register. He was counting the tips from the lunch shift. $12 here, he said, looking at the collection of bills and coins. $12 for 4 hours of work. That's pathetic. He looked up at her. "You know what your problem is, Aria? You're pathetic. People can sense it. That's why they don't tip. That's why they feel comfortable treating you like you're not really there." He pocketed the $12. She had earned that money. She had poured coffee, refilled water glasses, cleared the crumbs from the table where an old man had cried while eating pie, reminded another customer that the pancakes were coming. She had earned every cent of it. But the money disappeared into Derek's pocket anyway. The evening shift arrived. Aria's break was 30 minutes, from 8 p.m. to 8:30. She sat in the back room on a plastic crate, eating the remains of a burger that a customer had left half-finished on their plate. The burger was cold, the bun was stale, but it was food, and she could not afford to waste it. Her phone buzzed. A text from the shelter coordinator, Linda. "Ava asking about you. Can you call when you get a break?" She dialed immediately. Linda answered on the second ring. "Aria, thank God. Ava's fever broke, but she's asking why you haven't come to pick her up yet. Aria's heart fractured. Her daughter. Her 7-year-old daughter, sick, alone in the shelter, waiting for a mother who could not afford to leave her shift, could not afford to lose the job that barely kept them surviving. Tell her I will be there right after my shift. Tell her I love her. Tell her mommy's working as fast as she can. When she hung up, she sat in the darkness of the break room, breathing the smell of grease and industrial cleaner, and let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes. Then she wiped her eyes, composed her face, and returned to the diner. 30 minutes before closing, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up outside the diner. 3 of them, engines still running, windows tinted so dark you could not see inside. Men in expensive suits climbed out, black suits that cost more than everything Aria owned, Italian leather shoes clicking against the pavement, gold watches catching the streetlight. The men entered the diner. Derek immediately straightened, his entire demeanor changing from cruel to deferential in the span of a breath. "Gentlemen, welcome. Can I get you anything?" The men did not answer. They simply sat at the counter, their eyes moving across the empty diner with the calculating gaze of men accustomed to assessing threats. Aria continued working, refilling the coffee station, her movements small and careful. She had learned how to be invisible in rooms where dangerous men gathered. One of the men, tall, with silver threading through his dark hair, a scar running from his eye to his cheekbone, turned to look at her directly. His gaze was like a blade cutting through darkness. That was when Derek Collins stepped directly into her path, blocking her from view, his voice suddenly nervous. "Gentlemen, I'm sure your business is in the city, not in my humble." "Who is this woman?" the scarred man asked, his voice deep and solid like an oath spoken in a courtroom. Derek's jaw tightened. "Nobody. Just an employee." "She doesn't." But the scarred man was already rising from his seat, and everything was about to change in ways none of them could have predicted. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. 3 months before the night that would reshape everything, Aria Santos stood in front of the burned husk of her apartment building on Chicago's South Side, and the world smelled like the end of everything. The firefighters had packed up their equipment an hour ago, coiling hoses, securing ladders onto trucks that rumbled away into the gray dawn. Ash fell like snow. Wet ash, heavy with the weight of destruction, settling on her shoulders, in her hair, coating her orthopedic shoes, the ones with the broken heel she'd taped together with electrical tape because she could not afford new ones. She held one thing salvaged from the ruins. One photograph. The edges were singed black, the corners curled from heat, but the image remained, her husband, Marcus, 28 years old, smiling at the camera on their wedding day, his hand resting on her belly because she had been 3 months pregnant with Ava, and he had wanted to capture that moment, that hope, that future that would never arrive. Marcus died in a construction accident 14 months after that photograph was taken. A crane cable snapped. He fell for stories. By the time the ambulance arrived, there was nothing left to save except the memory of his voice, the shape of his hands, and this single photograph that fire had tried but failed to destroy. Aria looked down at her palm. $5. That was all the cash she had in the world. 5 single bills, worn soft from handling, creased in the middle. She had checked her bank account at the shelter's office computer that morning. 17 cents. Not enough to buy a coffee. Not enough to buy anything. The apartment fire had burned through her renter's insurance money in hospital bills when Ava developed pneumonia from the smoke exposure. The fire had eaten through her emergency fund, which had been $3,000 carefully accumulated over 8 years of double shifts and skipped meals. The fire had taken her clothes, her daughter's toys, the winter coat she'd been saving to replace, and the manila envelope hidden in the freezer that contained every dollar she'd managed to scrape together toward a down payment on something permanent, something safe, something that belonged to her and her daughter and could not be taken away by flames or fate or the cruelty of men with power. The shelter where Ava slept kept the cot in a room with 12 other cots, 7 of them occupied on most nights. Aria stood in the doorway now, 5 hours after identifying what remained of her apartment, watching her daughter sleep. Ava was 6 years old, small for her age, curled on her side in borrowed pink pajamas 2 sizes too large. The elastic at the waist had been pulled tight with a safety pin. The cuffs drooped past her fingertips. Even in sleep, Ava's face held the tight expression of a child learning too early that the world was not safe, that homes burned, that fathers did not come home, that mothers sometimes sat beside your bed in the darkness and cried so quietly you almost couldn't hear them, except that you were not quite asleep, you were pretending to sleep because your mother needed to cry and you needed her to think you didn't know that everything was gone. Aria sat on the edge of the cot and counted the $5 again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She did this 3 times, as if the number might change, as if mathematics might bend to mercy. It didn't. $5 meant breakfast for 2 days if she bought eggs and bread from the discount grocery. $5 meant nothing toward the deposit for an apartment. Rent in Chicago was $1,200 for a 1-bedroom in the neighborhoods where her job existed. First month, last month, deposit, $3,200 she did not have. She made $8.50 an hour at the diner. Tips came in consistently, and most of them disappeared into Derek Collins's pocket before they reached her apron. The diner where she worked was called Maggie's, though Maggie had sold the place in 1997 and died in 2003. Nobody bothered to change the sign. The establishment existed in a narrow storefront on 47th Street, its vinyl booths cracked and faded to a color that might have once been red, its fluorescent lights flickering with the irregular rhythm of dying electronics. The grease smell had aged into the walls so completely that scrubbing couldn't remove it. It was not a surface stain but a permanent state of the air itself, a flavor that coated your tongue and settled into your clothes and followed you home. The walk-in freezer hummed constantly, a sound like an animal struggling to breathe. The tile floor was sticky in places no amount of mopping could restore to cleanliness. Derek Collins had managed Maggie's for 11 years. He was 43 years old, with hair that looked perpetually unwashed and a coffee breath so thick you could smell it before he entered a room. He wore the same gray button-up shirt 5 days a week, the armpit stain darker than the rest of the fabric. His wedding ring was on his left hand, but his wife had left him 8 years ago, taking their 2 children to Iowa, and Derek had responded by treating every female employee as a possession, something to control, something to squeeze for compliance. On the morning of the fire, 3 weeks before that night at the diner counter when everything would shift, Derek had cornered Aria by the walk-in freezer during the transition between morning and afternoon shift. The freezer door was open, cold pouring out, and Aria was restocking containers of butter. Derek stepped into the doorway, blocking her exit. His shadow fell across the metal shelves. "You're on closing tonight," he said. His voice had that particular quality it took on when he was about to be cruel. "Maria called in sick." "That's 16 hours, Aria said, still facing the freezer, her hands moving through the butter containers. "I have to pick up my daughter from the shelter by 6. Mrs. Cheng closes the doors at. You want to keep this job or not?" Derek stepped closer. His shoulder brushed hers. "Not an accident. Because I got 3 applications sitting on my desk from girls who won't complain. Girls who understand that flexibility is how you move up in this business." She flinched. The freezer air hit her back, and she could feel his heat in front of her, the weight of him in the narrow space. His hand touched her arm. Just a brush of his fingers across her sleeve, but the intention was clear. Control. Ownership. The casual assertion that her body was something available for his use. "I'll stay," she whispered. "That's what I thought." "Good girl." She didn't respond. Didn't look at him. She waited until he left the freezer, and then she leaned against the cold metal and let herself breathe for 30 seconds before returning to the floor. The shift ran 11 hours because Derek made mistakes with the schedule and refused to acknowledge them. Aria's feet had begun to bleed through her orthopedic shoes by hour 8, the left heel, where the tape had separated, rubbed against bare skin with each step. By hour 11, her movements had become mechanical, thoughtless, a learned response to pain that was no longer particularly sharp because it had become background, constant, the normal state of existing in a body required to labor beyond its capacity. At 3:22 in the morning, Aria stood behind the counter and counted the tips in her apron pocket. $47 total earned across 16 hours. Derek had taken 24. He took them from the tip jar while she was cleaning the bathrooms, transferring them into his own pocket with the efficiency of someone for whom theft had become routine. Maggie's had 6 tables, and she had served them carefully, refilled water glasses without being asked, smiled at every customer despite her daughter sleeping on a cot at a shelter 4 miles away, despite the fact that she had exactly $5 in the world and no plan for how to feed her daughter next week. $23 remained. She placed the cash in an envelope and sealed it. The envelope went into her uniform pocket, closest to her heart, where it remained until she walked home through streets slick with the aftermath of rain, neon signs reflecting off wet asphalt in colors that meant nothing, reds and blues and yellows bleeding into the black pavement like the world was painting a picture of emptiness. The shelter was a converted warehouse on the west side. Aria walked there, took the bus, walked, covered 4 miles between closing the diner and arriving at the shelter's locked door at 4:02 in the morning. Mrs. Chen, who ran the shelter on a shoestring budget and the kind of love that made her indispensable to everyone in her care, let her in without comment. She had stopped asking Aria about her day. The answer was always the same: exhausted, humiliated, grateful to have the job at all. Ava was still asleep. Aria changed into the clean shirt she kept at the shelter, lay down on the cot beside her daughters, and counted the hours until she had to wake and begin the process again. Work. Survive. Return. Sleep. Repeat. 2 weeks until the shelter administrator's deadline. They could not keep her beyond that. 2 weeks to somehow produce $3,200 for an apartment or face the alternative, which was a bigger shelter, or a different shelter, or the streets. Aria had heard stories about what the streets did to mothers with children. She had learned not to think about them too directly, or the fear became a living thing that prevented action. She had $17 and some change to live on for the next 2 weeks. What she did not know was that in exactly 48 hours, her car would break down on a frozen highway in a storm, and a convoy of black SUVs would emerge from the darkness like a prophecy with an engine. What she did not know was that the man who would see her shivering on that roadside would understand, in a way that required no explanation, what it meant to hold something precious while the world tried to rip it away. What she could not imagine was that sometimes, mercy arrives at the exact moment it becomes unbearable to live without it. But first, there was the morning, and the shelter's breakfast of powdered eggs and toast, and Ava's small voice asking, "Mommy, will we get a new home soon?" And Aria, who had no answer, simply held her daughter and breathed. The November wind tore through the I-290 overpass like a blade wrapped in ice. Aria Santos sat in her 1997 Honda with her hands gripping the steering wheel, breath visible in small white clouds that dissipated into the darkness. The clock on the dashboard read 11:51 p.m. She turned the key again. Nothing. Just a clicking sound, metallic and hollow, like the car was laughing at her. Again. The same clicking. The engine was frozen solid, as frozen as everything else in her life had become. She stepped out into 18-degree cold wearing only a thin diner uniform and a second-hand coat with a broken zipper that had stopped closing 3 weeks ago. The stars overhead were sharp as diamonds, so bright and clear they almost hurt to look at. But Aria didn't look up. She looked down at the empty highway stretching in both directions, disappearing into nothing but darkness and frost and the sound of wind moving across abandoned concrete. No cars. No lights in the distance. Just her dead car, and the realization that her breakdown was happening exactly where everyone else had also broken down, alone, at night, in the cold, with no one coming. She rubbed her arms through the thin coat and counted her breath like she counted everything else now. 1, 2, 3. Small, controlled, rationed. She had learned to ration everything: food, heat, hope, air. She reached through the open window and turned on the dome light. From her pocket she pulled the $5 she had left. $5 in quarters and dimes spread across her palm like a prayer someone had already refused to answer. She had exactly $5 to her name, and she needed $200,000 in 7 days now instead of 2 weeks. The shelter director had that morning reduced her deadline. 7 days. 168 hours. Aria had learned math the hard way, through subtraction. The headlights appeared first as small white pinpricks in the distance. Then they grew, became 2 distinct circles of light, then became 4, then 5. A convoy of black SUVs materialized through the frozen night like a prophecy with an engine. They moved slowly, almost cautiously, and then they stopped. 30 feet from her. The engines cut. The silence that followed was complete. Doors opened. Men emerged first. Sergio was the largest, 6'4" with shoulders broad enough to block the wind, wearing a black wool coat that cost more than Aria's monthly rent used to cost. Theo came next, younger, with a scar running from his left eye down to his jaw, his hand resting casually near his jacket. 3 more men spread out in a loose formation, their movements synchronized like dancers who had performed the same routine 1,000 times. Every hand was visible. Every stance was a conversation conducted in body language. Then Rafael Moreno stepped out of the center SUV. He was 6'2" with the kind of presence that made the cold air seem to compress around him. Black wool coat tailored so precisely it looked like it had been sewn directly onto his body. Beneath it, a white shirt open at the collar, showing the edge of a silver chain and the kind of chest that came from decades of controlled discipline. His hair was dark, slicked back, with silver threading through at the temples like someone had carved frost into marble. But it was his eyes that made Aria look away first, dark, penetrating, the color of a storm-gathering force. A thin scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his cheekbone, not jagged but clean, the kind of scar that came from a blade moving with precision rather than rage. He looked at her standing beside her dead car, still holding the $5 in her open palm like she was offering tribute to a god. He looked at her stained waitress uniform, the grease spots from Derek Collins's diner that no amount of washing had removed. He looked at the broken zipper and the shoes worn through at the heels and the way her whole body was trembling but not moving, because moving meant panic, and Aria had learned that panic was a luxury she could not afford. Rafael walked toward her. Each step was deliberate, measured, the kind of walk that men learned when they understood that movement itself was a statement. He stopped 4 feet away. "How long have you been out here?" His voice was deep and solid like an oath, like something that once spoken could not be unspoken. Aria's throat tightened. She had learned not to trust men in expensive coats, had learned that kindness from them usually came with invisible chains attached. "I'm fine," she said, the lie sitting on her tongue like a stone. "I called someone." "Someone's coming." No one was coming. She had no phone. She had called no one. She was going to stand on this overpass in 18-degree cold until her fingers stopped working, and then until her heart stopped working, and when they found her in the morning she would be another statistic, another homeless woman who had run out of options and time and hope and the will to keep moving forward. Rafael studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his face. It was subtle, the tightening of his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed, but Aria saw it. She had become very good at reading the small movements that came before the big ones. She had learned to see the twitch that came before the hand. The inhale before the scream. The microscopic closing of the heart before rejection. He turned to Sergio without another word. "Put her car on a flatbed. Find out what's wrong with the engine. Fix it if you can, sell it for parts if you can't. Then bring her with us." "Yes, sir," Sergio said, already moving. Aria's instinct was to run. Every cell in her body was screaming to run, to protest, to refuse, to insist that she was fine and would be fine and needed nothing from anyone. But her legs wouldn't move. The cold had crystallized them where they stood. So instead she said, "I don't need." Rafael was already walking back toward his SUV. He didn't turn around when he spoke. "It's 18 degrees. You'll be dead in an hour. Get in the car." The tone that built an empire. The tone that ended empires. The tone that said this was not a request being made but a decision already rendered, and her only choice was whether to comply or be made to comply. Aria looked at the empty highway stretching in both directions. She looked at the stars. She thought of Ava in the shelter, sleeping in borrowed clothes on a cot beside her mother's cot, both of them counting hours until they were told to leave. She thought of the $5 still gripped in her palm. She thought of the 7 days remaining. She walked toward the SUV and got in. The interior was warm. Leather seats so soft they seemed to absorb her weight rather than support it. A glass of water was already waiting in the cup holder. Someone had anticipated her arrival, which meant someone had already known she would be here. The SUV pulled smoothly away from the overpass, and Aria watched her dead car disappear in the side mirror, watching the only thing she had owned alone since her husband died fade into darkness. Sergio drove. Rafael sat in the front seat, his silhouette sharp against the lights of downtown Chicago beginning to emerge through the windshield as they descended toward the city. They didn't speak. The silence was profound, the kind of silence that made Aria aware of her own breathing, her own heartbeat, the small involuntary sounds her body made when it was afraid. The building appeared like a monument to everything she would never have. 40 stories of glass and steel rising against the night sky, lit from within so it glowed like something alive and hungry. Rafael's building. The kind of building that had a name, that people pointed at and spoke about in careful, fearful tones. The kind of building that existed in a completely different world than the one Aria inhabited. The elevator was private and rose so smoothly that Aria's body didn't register movement until the numbers changed. 40. 41. 42. Her ears popped. The door opened directly into a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago's glittering lights, and the sight of it made her knees weak because nothing had prepared her for the reality of this much space, this much glass, this much sky contained within 4 walls. Sergio gestured toward a leather sofa. Mr. Moreno will return shortly. There is tea in the kitchen if you require it. Aria sat on the edge of the leather sofa, her worn shoes barely touching the marble floor. She was still holding the $5. She looked at it in her palm and felt something break inside her chest, some final wall giving way to the reality that $5 was all she had, and it was nothing. Then screaming came from somewhere deep in the penthouse. A child's scream of pure pain, high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the silence like an alarm. Then another scream. Then silence that was somehow worse than the screaming because silence meant endurance, meant the pain had become so familiar that screaming was no longer necessary. Rafael appeared from the hallway. Aria had never seen panic on a human face before, not real panic, not the kind that strips away everything controlled and leaves only the animal need to fix something broken. His face was drained of color, and for just an instant she saw not Chicago's most dangerous man but only a father whose child was suffering. "Come," he said to Aria, not explained why, not asked permission. He simply walked toward the screaming and expected her to follow. She did. The girl's bedroom was all white walls and soft lighting and toys that probably cost more than the shelter cost to operate annually. Sophia was 7 years old with dark curls plastered to her forehead with sweat, her small body contorted under white sheets, both hands gripping the fabric like it was the only solid thing in a world that had become liquid and unstable. Her fever was visible in the flush across her cheeks, the way her eyes couldn't focus, the way her body trembled with temperature that had spiked to 104.7 degrees according to the doctor standing beside her. 3 doctors, actually. 3 of Chicago's best, and none of them helping. They argued in technical language about antibiotics and viral strains and the necessity of hospital transfer. Rafael stood frozen at the foot of the bed, hands clenched into fists, watching his daughter suffer and unable to do anything because he was a man who moved through the world by force and fear and will, and none of those things worked against fever. Aria moved to the bedside without conscious decision. She reached down and took Sophia's small hand, the skin burning hot enough to hurt. "Hey, sweetheart," Aria said softly, her voice barely a whisper above the trembling. "My name is Aria. What's yours?" Sophia's eyes focused on her for just an instant. "It hurts," the girl whimpered. "Everything hurts." I know it does." Aria's voice was steady in a way that surprised her. "But you're going to be okay. Can you squeeze my hand? Just like this." She demonstrated with her fingers, a gentle pressure, patient and safe. Sophia squeezed weakly. Aria moved to the bathroom and soaked a cloth in cool water. She returned and placed it on Sophia's forehead, pressing gently, moving in slow circles. She spoke about nothing, about stars that were sharp enough to cut, about her own daughter Ava who was scared of the dark too, about a story her husband used to tell before the car accident that took him forever. Her voice was like a rope extending into darkness, something to hold, something steady, something that might carry her toward safety. Sophia's breathing slowed. The screaming stopped. Her tiny hand refused to let go of Aria's hand, even as her eyes closed and her fever-bright face finally went slack with something approaching rest. Hours passed. Aria cooled the child's forehead, whispered comfort, watched the fever inch downward degree by degree. 104.6, 104.1, 103.8, and Rafael stood in the doorway watching both of them, his men entering and leaving silently, their eyes betraying shock at what they were witnessing. Sergio whispered to Theo by the window, "In 15 years I've never seen him like this." Near dawn, Sophia's fever broke to 101.2 and stayed there. She slept deeply, her small hand still gripping Aria's hand, and Aria herself was so exhausted that she couldn't imagine moving again, couldn't imagine a world in which she stood up and walked away. Rafael moved her to the sitting room adjacent to Sophia's bedroom. Morning light was beginning to break over Chicago, turning the sky from black to deep blue to gray. The windows showed the city waking up below them, all those millions of people beginning their days with no idea of the things happening 40 stories above them. "Her name is Sophia," Rafael said, sitting across from Aria, and his voice carried the weight of someone speaking about the most important thing in his life. "She's all I have." Aria waited. She understood that there was more, that some people needed silence to fill their own stories with their own words. "I had another child once," Rafael continued, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles went white. 12 years ago. A son. He never came home from the hospital. The nursery. He stopped. Swallowed hard. I never dismantled it. I should have. I couldn't. Aria thought of the photograph of her husband, how she had carried it through the fire, how it was now her only remaining possession besides the borrowed clothes and the $5. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," she said quietly. "Car accident. I still can't move his photo from the nightstand. Or I couldn't. It burned 3 months ago with everything else." She told him everything. Not because she trusted him, but because something in his face said he understood loss, and there was no one left in her life who did. She told him about the fire that took her apartment. About the shelter. About Ava in borrowed clothes, sleeping alone, terrified. About Derek Collins at the diner, stealing tips, cornering waitresses, making her work 16-hour shifts while her daughter counted hours in the dark. "I need $200,000, Aria said, the number falling from her mouth like a confession. "I need it in 7 days now. 7 days to get an apartment, get stable, get my daughter back to something like normal." "And I have?" She opened her hand to show him. $5. $5 in the entire world. Rafael watched her. His face was unreadable. "Why would I help you?" Aria asked, her voice breaking. You're a stranger. And I'm nobody." She flinched at the word. "At the truth of it." "Sit down," Rafael said, and it was a command, not a request. Aria Saturday. "My daughter asked for you. In 15 years, my men have never seen me kneel to anyone. But I knelt to you tonight, begging you to stay with her because you're the only one who made her stop screaming. So tell me what you need." 3 blocks away, in the diner on the south side where the neon lights hummed and flickered, Derek Collins was closing up for the night. He moved through the empty kitchen with the confidence of a man who understood that no one would challenge him, that the young waitresses he hired had no recourse, no protection, no voice that mattered. He opened the register and pocketed the tips from the evening shift, $47 that belonged to Maria, the newest girl, the one he'd been working on for weeks. $47 she would never see. And 40 blocks north, in an office overlooking Michigan Avenue, Catherine Mercer was reading through documents, her pale blue eyes scanning lines of legal language that suddenly made her realize something extremely valuable had become vulnerable. Rafael Moreno's only child, Sophia. The inheritance clause that connected her to Rafael's empire, the part of the will that said if anything happened to the girl, her guardianship transferred to a trust, and if there was no one else to speak for her, the courts would appoint someone. Someone like Catherine, whose family had old money and older connections. Catherine smiled, sharp as a knife. She picked up her phone and made a call that would set events in motion, that would put men with guns in motion, that would make decisions that could not be unmade. She was playing a game that required leverage, and leverage was easiest to obtain when someone was desperate. When someone had everything to lose. What Catherine Mercer didn't know was that she had just made a calculation error. She had assumed Rafael Moreno would crumble under pressure. She had assumed Aria Santos was a casualty, not a shield. She had assumed that fear was still the only currency that mattered. She was about to learn otherwise. 3 days after the bullet stopped, Aria Santos sat on a bench outside the shelter on Halsted Street, her coat pulled tight against the November wind that cut like a blade wrapped in ice. The pavement was still wet from earlier rain, and neon signs from the closed storefronts reflected red and blue across the asphalt like spilled paint. Her hands trembled. Not from the cold. From certainty. The letter was folded inside her coat pocket, written in her careful handwriting the night before. Every word a goodbye. Every sentence an explanation that no one would accept, but she had to try anyway. She pulled the envelope out and read it one more time, though she had already memorized every line. Rafael, I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry. What I feel for you, what I feel when I am near Sophia, these are things I have no right to feel. But I feel them anyway, and that is the problem. Every time I hope, everything burns. My apartment burned. My husband burned in a hospital bed because I could not afford his medicine. And I will not let what happened to them happen to you. I will not let my cursed life touch your daughter. She deserves someone better than a woman who brings fire and loss to everyone she touches. By the time you read this, I will be gone. I will disappear into the city, and you will be safe. Sophia will be safe. Please tell her that I loved her. Tell her that the colors she gave me, they were the most precious gift anyone has ever given me. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. I should have stayed nobody. It would have been safer for you. The words blurred. She folded the letter again, put it back in her pocket, and stood to leave. Her legs ached. Her ribs were still sore from the beating Derek Collins had given her in the diner storage room 3 weeks ago, before Rafael's men had found her and brought her to the hospital. Before everything changed. She would slip the letter under Rafael's door. She would leave the city by morning. She would become nobody again. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text message. Sophia is asking for you. Please come. Sergio. Aria closed her eyes. The wind pushed her hair across her face. She should delete the message. She should turn off the phone. She should walk away from the bus stop and never look back. Instead, she opened her eyes and started walking toward the nearest CTA station. The elevator in Rafael's building hummed as it climbed toward the 40th floor. Aria stood alone in the polished car, watching the numbers rise. 30. 35. 40. The door slid open. The hallway erupted in gunfire. Aria's scream caught in her throat. Men in tactical gear were positioned along the corridor, their weapons raised, their movements precise and coordinated. Rafael stood with his back against Sophia's bedroom door, Sergio and Theo flanking him, returning fire with cold precision. The sound was unbearable, a percussion of violence that made her ears ring. But what froze her was the sight of Sophia's small figure in the darkness of her bedroom, visible through the open doorway, her nightgown white and impossibly fragile. One of the gunmen swung his weapon toward the child. Leverage. Catherine Mercer's orders. Take the girl. Maintain leverage. Aria didn't think. Her body moved without permission from her mind. She ran. The distance between them collapsed in seconds. She threw herself between Sophia and the gunman's aim, her arms spread wide like someone trying to shield a flame from the wind. The first bullet hit her left shoulder. Pain exploded through her like lightning, but she didn't move. She braced her feet and stayed standing. The second bullet tore through her right side. Blood spilled across her shirt. She gasped, tasted copper, felt her ribs scream, but she didn't move aside. The third bullet caught her thigh. Her leg buckled. She dropped to one knee, still blocking the child, still refusing to yield. The fourth bullet grazed her ribs with fire. The fifth hit her abdomen. She collapsed. Sophia's scream was a sound that would live in Aria's bones forever. Rafael dropped his weapon and caught her as she fell, his arms sliding beneath her, his hands slick with her blood. "No, no, no, Aria, stay with me, stay with me." His voice shattered. Tears streamed down his face, the most powerful man in Chicago's underworld, weeping openly, cradling a dying woman like she was the only real thing he had ever held. Sergio froze mid-step. In 15 years of serving Rafael Moreno, he had never seen his boss weep. Never seen him hold anyone like this. Never seen the fortress crumble. Theo was already on his radio, voice shaking. "Medical emergency. 40th floor. Multiple gunshot wounds. Get the ambulance here now." The gunmen retreated. Their mission had failed. Their target was protected by something stronger than weapons. Rafael's men advanced through the hallway like ghosts reclaiming their territory. Sophia clung to Aria's hand, her small fingers gripping with desperate strength. "Don't go. Don't go. Don't go." But Aria was already fading into darkness. For hours later, at 4:17 in the morning, the hospital waiting room was silent except for the beep of machines and the whisper of fluorescent lights. Rafael sat in a plastic chair, still wearing her blood. His hands hadn't stopped shaking. Sergio sat beside him, watching his boss the way one watches a man on the edge of a cliff. The elevator doors opened. A nurse appeared, directing them to the surgical wing. Aria was stable. The bullets had missed her vital organs by distances measured in millimeters. Surgery had taken 8 hours and 45 minutes. She would live. When Sergio handed Rafael Aria's coat, retrieved from the hallway, torn and stained, the letter fell out. Rafael read it slowly. Once. Then again. Then a third time, his jaw clenching tighter with each word. She was going to leave them. She had written her goodbye before she even arrived. She thought she was cursed. She thought that loving his daughter would destroy her. Something inside Rafael broke and rebuilt simultaneously. All the control he had spent 12 years perfecting, all the distance he had maintained from every person in his empire, all the walls he had constructed against feeling, they shattered like glass. He held the letter to his chest and wept. Sergio looked away, but he knew. Everyone would know by morning. Their boss had found something worth losing his armor for. And he was going to burn down the city to protect her? At 5:22 a.m., Derek Collins opened the diner at South Morgan Street, yawning as he reached for the register. He was already counting the tips he had stolen from the night shift. $83. Every cent meant money out of the waitress's pockets and into his. The black van pulled up outside. 12 men in dark suits stepped out, moving with the kind of synchronization that came from years of following orders. Derek's coffee cup fell and shattered on the tile floor. He tried to run. They were faster. The lead man, whose face was carved from stone and whose voice carried no emotion whatsoever, stepped directly into Derek's path. "Derek Collins. Mr. Moreno sends his regards." Derek's legs gave out. He collapsed against the counter, his hands raised in a gesture that meant nothing. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a manager. I didn't do anything. Please?" "You stole from her," the man said, his voice flat as pavement. You touched her. You threatened her. I'll disappear, Derek gasped, his words tumbling out like water from a broken pipe. I'll leave Chicago. I'll leave the country. You'll never see me again. I swear to God, you'll never see me again. You're absolutely right about that last part, the lead man said. They dragged him screaming into the van. His voice echoed off the brick walls of the diner, a sound like an animal in a trap, like the last moment before silence. The van doors closed. Derek Collins was driven to a warehouse on the Chicago docks, the kind of place that didn't appear on any map, where the walls were soundproofed and the concrete floor had seen things that would haunt a living conscience. He was handed over to the Castellano family, Rafael's oldest rival, the organization that had perfected the art of making people suffer slowly. The door closed behind him. He was never seen again. At 7:03 a.m., Catherine Mercer sat in her Lincoln Park mansion, the kind of place that had belonged to her family for 3 generations, where the crown molding cost more than Aria Santos made in a year. She sipped coffee from a china cup and checked her phone for updates from her hired men. Nothing. She frowned and tried calling the lead operative. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. Her doorbell rang. When she opened the door, 20 FBI agents in dark jackets stood on her threshold like a wall of judgment. The lead agent, a woman with tired eyes and absolute authority, held a warrant in her hand. Catherine Mercer, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, attempted murder, racketeering, and wire fraud. Catherine's face drained of blood. This is absurd. I want my lawyer. Do you understand who I am? My family has connections in this city that go back. We know exactly who you are, the agent said, her voice cutting through Catherine's words like a knife through silk. We also know about the offshore accounts. The shell companies. The attempted hit on a 7-year-old child. They cuffed her in front of her housekeeper, whose face was a study in shocked satisfaction. They perp-walked her past the marble foyer, past the paintings worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, past every symbol of power she had ever accumulated. By 8 a.m., her face was on every news channel in the city. By 9 a.m., her assets were frozen. By noon, a federal indictment had been filed. 40 years minimum. Her society friends deleted her number. Her lawyer quit, filing a motion to withdraw from representation. Her foundation board issued a statement distancing themselves from her. Catherine Mercer sat in a holding cell, silk blouse wrinkled, makeup smeared, fingernails broken from clawing at the metal bench. She had spent her entire life believing that wealth meant protection, that her family name was a shield, that power could not be taken from someone like her. She was learning otherwise. Not death. Too quick. Too easy. Too merciful. This was systematic destruction. 3 days after the bullet stopped, Aria Santos woke to the sound of rainfall against hospital windows. Her eyes opened slowly, each eyelid heavy as stone, and the first thing she registered was pain, sharp, insistent, spreading across her chest and shoulders like a map of fire. She tried to move. Her body refused. Tubes ran from her arms like spider silk, clear liquid dripping steadily into her veins. She was alive. The thought came with genuine surprise, as if she had not expected to survive, as if her body was a borrowed thing she had only been permitted to use temporarily. Sophia was asleep in the chair beside her bed, the 7-year-old small hand wrapped around Aria's finger even in sleep, as if afraid that loosening her grip would make the woman disappear again. Her breathing was soft, peaceful, the fever finally gone. That was the only thing that mattered. The child lived. The bullets had found their mark, 5 of them, tearing through Aria's body, but Sophia remained untouched, protected by a waitress with $5 and absolute conviction. The hospital room was drowning in flowers. Roses in crystal vases. Lilies that filled the air with heavy perfume. Orchids in shades of purple so dark they looked almost black. The cards attached read like a registry of power, from the mayor, from hospital board members, from people whose names suggested old money and older secrets. But it was the single dandelion in a paper cup, drawn by Ava's 6-year-old hand and labeled for being the bravest mommy, that made Aria's throat close. Rafael stood by the window, silhouetted against afternoon light that poured through glass like liquid gold. His suit was wrinkled, actually wrinkled, the charcoal fabric creased as if he had slept in it, or not slept at all. 3 days of stubble darkened his jaw. His eyes were hollow, red-rimmed, the eyes of a man who had spent 72 hours living inside a nightmare. When he saw Aria's eyes open, he moved in 2 strides, crossing the room like a blade cutting through air. "You're awake," he said. His voice was raw, barely a whisper, nothing like the thunder she remembered. Something in his chest had broken when the bullets came. She could hear it in those 2 words. Aria tried to speak. Her throat produced only a sound like gravel. She coughed, and even that small movement sent white lightning through her ribs. She forced the words anyway. "Sophia. Is she? She's fine. She's safe. She's right there." Rafael sat on the edge of the bed, careful to avoid her bandaged shoulders, and he took her hand with the gentleness of someone handling something that might shatter. "Because of you. You took 5 bullets meant for her. Why would you do that?" The question hung in the quiet room. Outside, Chicago rain continued its percussion against the glass. "Because she's 7 years old," Aria whispered, "and I couldn't let her die." Rafael's jaw tightened. For a moment he said nothing. Then, "I found your letter. The one you wrote the night before. I know what you intended. You thought you were cursed. That your presence would bring danger to us." Aria closed her eyes. The letter. She had written it in the borrowed apartment, sitting at a kitchen table that wasn't hers, using paper that belonged to someone else, trying to explain the impossible, that she had to leave, had to vanish, had to remove herself from their lives like a contamination being cleaned away. She had every intention of walking out before dawn, before they woke, before anyone could stop her. Instead, the bullets came first. Rafael continued, his voice building with something fierce and determined. "Aria. Listen to me. You are the first person in 15 years to make me feel something other than rage. You saved my daughter's life with your own body. You are not cursed. You are extraordinary." Tears rolled down the side of her face into her hair. She did not wipe them away. Her arms would not move that far. She simply lay there while the man who ruled Chicago's underworld held her hand like she was made of glass, like she was the most valuable thing he had ever possessed. When she could speak again, her voice was barely audible. "What about Derek?" "Gone," Rafael said. His tone shifted, becoming something cold and precise. "He's no longer your concern. Catherine Mercer is in a federal holding cell with 40 years minimum sentencing for conspiracy to commit murder and racketeering. Her assets are frozen. Her foundation is dissolving. Her society friends have erased her. She will spend the rest of her life in a cell smaller than the walk-in closet she once had." Aria stared at him. "How?" "Details. What matters is that you're safe. That Sophia is safe. That Derek Collins will never steal from anyone again." Rafael stood and retrieved an envelope from the table beside the flowers. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. He placed the envelope in her hand. "This is yours." Aria opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a check. She looked at the numbers, at the words printed beside them, $200,000. Her vision blurred. The paper shook in her hand. "I can't accept this," she whispered. "Yes, you can." Rafael sat again, closer now. "Aria, look at me." She forced her eyes to meet his. "Your old car has been replaced with a new one. Title in your name. An apartment is secured, 2 bedrooms, safe neighborhood, first 6 months paid. You and Ava will never sleep in a shelter again. You will never count $5 trying to figure out how to eat. You will never work for someone who steals from you." He paused. Because when I held you bleeding in my arms, when I felt your heart stop and then start again, I realized I couldn't let you go. Aria's breath caught. Why would you do this for me? She asked, though she already knew the answer, could see it burning in his eyes like something alive. Because Sophia asked for you. Because you stayed when you could have run. Because you were willing to die for someone you barely knew. Rafael's hand moved to her face, careful to avoid the bandage on her temple. His thumb traced her cheekbone with unbearable gentleness. Because I'm asking you not to disappear. That evening, Ava arrived at the hospital, brought by Sergio, who looked like he had aged 10 years in 3 days. The 6-year-old ran to her mother's bedside, careful of the tubes and bandages, and buried her face against Aria's arm. Sophia woke at the commotion, and the two girls stared at each other for a long moment, one child who had been drowning in fever and fear, the other who had been drowning in the shelter system, each seeing something familiar in the other's eyes. Sophia scooted over on her chair and patted the seat. Want to sit? Ava climbed up without hesitation. They held hands, small fingers intertwining, the way children do when they have already decided that they belong to each other. Rafael and Aria watched, and something unspoken passed between the adults, the recognition that a family, true family, is not always written in blood. Sometimes it is written in moments of absolute clarity, in the space between one heartbeat and the next. 1 week later, Aria stood in her new apartment, her hands running along the countertop of a kitchen that was clean and quiet and entirely hers. Ava was in the bedroom, her own bedroom, with a bed that had new sheets and a pillow that smelled like fabric softener, exploring clothes in a closet that was no longer empty. Rafael carried in the last box, setting it down carefully on the floor. He looked at her with eyes that had learned, finally, how to hold something other than anger. This is too much, Aria said. It's not enough, Rafael replied. It will never be enough. Aria turned to face him fully, and for the first time since the shooting, she stood without pain binding her ribs. The wounds would scar. The scars would fade over years. But she was standing, and she was here, and she was choosing to stay. What happens now? She asked. Rafael stepped closer. Now you heal. You let me take care of you and Ava the way you took care of Sophia. And when you're ready, when you're truly ready. He paused, his voice dropping. Maybe you let me prove that one hand reached out at the right moment can change everything. She froze. Those words. Her words. She had written them in that letter, the goodbye letter he had found. You memorized it, she whispered. Every word. He touched her face with infinite care. Because you saved my life, Aria. Sophia would have died, and I would have died with her. But you stopped that. You chose to be a shield when the bullets came. He kissed her forehead, and from the bedroom, Sophia and Ava giggled, 2 children building a new world from the rubble of the old. 6 months later, Aria worked at a cafe that Rafael owned, a place where the manager treated staff with respect and tips were never stolen. She didn't need the job. But she chose it anyway, chose the rhythm of morning espresso and afternoon regulars, chose the reminder that she had once stood in another diner, counting $5, believing she was invisible. Now the city looked at her and saw exactly who she was, the woman who took 5 bullets and lived. That evening, Rafael stood in what had once been an empty nursery. The room he had kept frozen for 12 years, waiting for a daughter who would never come home. Aria helped him pack away the clothes, the unused crib, the toys that had waited in darkness. He held a small blue blanket and wept. She held him while he cried. I thought I'd never have this, he whispered. A family. A second chance. We both get second chances, Aria said. That's the gift. That's what it means to survive. Later that night, the 4 of them walked through downtown Chicago, Rafael and Aria, Sophia and Ava, the girls running ahead holding hands while city lights reflected in every window. Rafael took Aria's hand. She looked up at him, this man who had been rendered helpless by love and saved by a woman with nothing but absolute conviction. Do you ever think about that night on the highway? She asked. When your convoy found me. Every day, he said. What made you stop? I saw someone who needed help. I didn't know you'd end up saving me instead. The rain had stopped. The sky was clear. And in the space where two broken people had collided, something entirely new had been born, a family rebuilt from ashes, a future written in second chances, a life that proved one moment of courage can change everything. This story teaches us that even in the darkest moments, love finds a way. If you believe that, hit like and subscribe. Leave a comment and tell us how this story made you feel. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.